Alright, so now we're going to talk about wrist pain in a different way, and this is going to be how to modify your practice. If you're having wrist pain when you're going through your practice, then we have to change something. We don't ever want to just muscle through it. It's our warning sign that something isn't right. The first thing that you want to do is talk to your teacher about your alignment. There's a lot of poses that if your alignment is off, it's going to put too much stress in your wrists. Upward facing dog is probably the #1 culprit for this. If your chest is too far in front of your hands, your wrist is going to go past the 90-degree bend, and there's going to be a whole lot of strain in this area. So make sure that you talk to your teacher about checking your alignment when you do your upward facing dog, especially if you're doing a lot of vinyasas during your practice. It's going to end up giving you a cumulative stress injury. So make sure that your alignment is what it's supposed to be. Now, if your alignment is good and maybe there's something going on in your wrist that it's not quite as stable as it should be, if you've sprained it a few times or something like that, then you're going to have to modify your practice so that you're not getting pain when you're doing different poses. There's a few different things you can do. The easiest one is probably just, instead of going flat hand onto the mat, you can flip over and go on a fist. And the fist is going to keep your wrist totally straight and neutral. And you can do all sorts of poses there. You can do your table, you can go into plank. Downward facing dog is a little bit harder, and we'll talk about a few different ways that you can modify that, because I think down dog is one of those poses where a lot of people have wrist pain. So first you want to make sure that you're using your hand properly. The hand is supposed to be really active whenever it's on the mat. Whenever we're doing weight bearing, there's any kind of body weight going into our hand, we have to make sure that the hand is active and it's spread open. You're not just kind of flopping it down onto the mat with no intention. When the hand goes onto the mat, it's open really wide, and you can see when I open wide, the palm of my hand has really good arches. And we know that arches create strength, so it's why the wrist bones create an arch. That arch is the carpal tunnel. That little tunnel that goes underneath the arch is where all of our nerves and our tendons pass through. So we need to maintain a good arch in our wrist and a good arch in our palm in order for our hand to be strong. Once the hand is down onto the mat, we want to create some strength through the fingers. So the tip of each finger is very gently gripping the mat. There's a tiny little bend in the fingers. And you want to make sure that you're not squeezing so hard that you get white knuckles, that you're not getting any circulation in your hands. It's a soft press with the fingertips, but it's enough to create some intention, some strength through your hands. The other important thing is any time that you have the hand down onto the mat, you want to make sure your weight doesn't sink into the pinky finger side, right over to here. This is kind of a bony area. It'll get sore from pressing into the mat, but more importantly, there are some ligaments over here in your wrist that are very sensitive, and if you constantly load into those ligaments, they're going to get angry. So we have to press our weight into the stronger end of the hand, which is the base of the thumb here and here, and the base of the index finger. So anytime that you have the hands on the ground, just a little shift, take the weight away from here and bring it into this triangle. Now the important thing is too, if you're in a pose for a really long time and your shoulders are starting to get tired, you're not pulling weight out of your hands, so you're going to start to feel some strain in your wrists. If your shoulders get tired in down dog or in plank or something like that, drop your knees down to save your wrists and save your shoulders too. If you start to fatigue and you're pushing too far, then you're going to end up injuring yourself. But the other thing that I always watch for with my students is if you're starting to get fatigued and your hands aren't as active as they should, you're going to start to get this tent happening, where the index finger knuckle starts to peel up off the mat. And you'll see what happens as soon as that starts to lift, your weight goes down into that part of the wrist that we don't want to load into. So that would be your indicator. If your hand starts doing that, you need to drop your knees down and take a rest. So drop down through the index finger, through the thumb, and just feel how that loads into the strong part of your hand. Now if that's still not working for you, even when you're moving your hand properly, then we start looking at modifications. One of them is using dumbbells, and you can put them, these are really nice because they have a flat edge, so they sit perfectly on the mat, and I can wrap my hand around them and hold on to them. You can also buy wooden handles that are the same kind of shape. But most people have dumbbells, so that's easy. And then that way your wrist is a little bit more toward neutral and you're lifted up off the mat. That's good if having your fist down on the mat causes you any kind of pain in your knuckles. You can do this version. So the next version is using a yoga wedge. And this one can either be Velcroed together, put a little piece of Velcro in between them, or they can be taken apart. This is good because if you're doing a vinyasa class, you're going to be stepping your foot up and back on the mat when you go into different versions. So if you buy the wedge and it's just one solid wedge, you might want to cut it in half like I did and have the option to separate it so that when you're going into lunge, you can get your foot up in between and you're not stepping on the wedge. But the important thing about using the wedge is that the heel of your hand is on that incline and then the fingers can come down onto the mat and then create that same feeling of pressing through the pads of each finger, lifting through the arch, lifting through the wrist, using your belly to pull weight out of your hands and out of your shoulders. Because these are really tiny joints in our hands and they're not supposed to have huge amounts of stress in them. The muscles, as you get closer to the center of the body, get larger and we want to use the strength from those. So practice with that wedge and then you can try and go into table or go into down dog or things like that and see what it feels like. A lot of times I will take the wedge and put it underneath my mat though, because the texture of these isn't really grippy, so your hand will start to slide. So I usually put mine underneath my mat if I'm using it so that my hand gets a little bit more grip. So if you don't have a wedge just yet, you can also take your mat and roll it back a few times and create the same sort of effect. Put the heel of your hand onto the roll and the fingers and the knuckles down onto the floor so that there's a little bit less of a bend in your wrist than if it was totally flat. Okay. Now if none of those things are working for you to modify, then you have to pretty much just take your wrists out of the equation. You have to find a way to modify where there's no pressure on your wrists, where you're not weight bearing, which is actually possible. Because yoga is so adaptable, we can use all of our props and change the way that we're doing poses to make sure that we're accommodating for what our body needs and we're practicing ahimsa, not causing any additional harm. So we can do a lot of modifications down on the forearms instead of being flat in table or in plank. You can just do a forearm version of it. That's great because you can still spread your fingers and practice gripping and practice making that arch with your hands when you're in the forearm version. If you want to be a little bit more level with yourself, like if you're doing different variations in table, then you can take your forearms onto a block or maybe even 2 blocks if you want to be up a little bit higher, and then you can do any sort of variations here that you need to do. So down dog, like I was saying, is one of those ones where people with wrist problems have a lot of issues in down dog. So if you need to, just practice dolphin instead. Open the hands, drop the forearms down onto the mat, curl the toes underneath, and it's the exact same shape with the rest of the body, but the hips go up toward the air. So that might be a better option for you. But definitely make sure that you find out what is actually causing the pain in your wrist if you need to go to a doctor, or find out what the root of the problem is so that you can address it and not just kind of ignore it or mask it. But also make sure that you explore the use of props so that you can adjust your practice and customize it to you, and talk to your teacher about what kind of options there are, and that should help. Namaste.